From the outset, let me say that this video is going to offend people, because it's going to tell some unpleasant truths about what's going on in a particular community. Truths that the media has covered up, censored, and denied. I'm making this video because it is long overdue. Because so many lies have been told regarding this subject for so long, many will recoil from it, like a junkie having withdrawals. The refusal to discuss white-on-white crime and to instead focus on so-called black-on-black crime has become psychological heroin to a lot of people in the white community. They know it's wrong to look away from the violence in their own communities. They know that it's dishonest to claim that the numbers of black-on-black crime is out of hand, yet when it's pointed out that white-on-white violence is far higher, they decide that that doesn't matter. These are the same people who will tell you that all lives matter, but apparently not to them. We've seen some people talking about white genocide, but mostly to push the same old racialist nonsense. Well, the white numbers in America are dwindling. The concern over so-called white genocide is real and I think to an extent even justified. But unless you're willing to be honest about what the white genocide really is and who's responsible for it, then you're not going to stop it. I am a concerned citizen. I see the total savagery that the white community inflicts on itself daily, the random, widespread loss of life that is not being talked about, and I want it to end. I see the white media contributing to the bloodshed through a conspiracy of silence, censoring any and all news regarding the daily slaughter of white people at the hands of other white people. The numbers tell the story. This has gone beyond mere killing. It's at the levels of genocide now. In the 1990s, we heard all about the Hutus and Tutsi killing one another in Rwanda. We've heard about Darfur, yet here we have a homegrown genocide playing itself out, and the political correctness of the white media prevents anyone from being able to speak out. We'll know more. By getting this issue out in the open, I hope to help start a long overdue national dialogue about white-on-white crime, to end the cover-up, and by doing so stop this self-inflicted genocide. Firstly, we have to get white people themselves to admit that there's a problem. They admit that the killing of whites by other whites in America is far higher than the phony black-on-black issue, yet the white community insists on focusing on black people anyway. Keeping up appearances is literally the death of the white community in the U.S. This is the reason for the white community's hyper-obsession with so-called black-on-black crime. The white media will tell you that they don't have a racial bias as to whose crimes they report, but all you have to do is look at who gets arrested for felonies. Whites are well over half the arrestees in any given county, and then look at who the white media chooses to put on the front page of the paper or to have lead the news, and they're almost always black. Now, some of the more savvy racists will try to use this deflection. This newest line of crap goes something like this. The television stations and newspapers are located in the heart of the city, and since that's where most of the black populations are concentrated, it's easier to drive a news van 5 minutes to the hood than it is to drive 20 minutes out to the suburbs. Now, this is one of those admissions that's equal parts truth and lies so as to confuse the listener. While it's true black populations and the media outlets are located in the inner city close to one another, it is not true that the white community is so far away as to make it an undue burden for the white media to do their jobs. The white community is certainly not so far away that the white media cannot give us daily updates on every suburban charity ball, suburban baseball game, suburban community play, and suburban social event that these white suburbanites have. They report on those things every single day, and for some reason it's not too hard for them to get their news vans out to the white areas then. Whites love to tell everyone that their fixation with black-on-black crime is because it's so widespread, but that's another lie. Black-on-black crime is located in one place: the poor areas of the inner city. Places where the poorest people are compressed into the most impoverished living conditions, overpopulated and underserved. There's a reason why crime is so high on Chicago's South Side and completely unheard of in, say, Uniondale, New York, which is one of the wealthiest black enclaves in America. White crime, on the other hand, is literally everywhere, and neither income level nor state of education has any impact on the white-on-white violence that you're going to find. In fact, the more affluent the neighborhood, the more vicious the white-on-white crime tends to be. White-on-white crime is literally everywhere. It's in the inner city, the suburbs, out in the county, out in the wilderness of the national parks. It's in the schools, the churches, the city halls, movie theaters, shopping malls. Nowhere is safe from white-on-white crime. If a Muslim shoots someone, it's okay to call it Muslim violence. To not do so is political correctness. But to point out what the FBI itself says, that white males are the primary ones responsible for mass shootings and terrorist violence in the U.S., all of a sudden that's not important. So clearly it's not violence here that concerns them. This is a matter of a white media with an open racial bias, using lies to cover their behinds. The reason the white media doesn't cover white people's crimes is for the same reason the police don't arrest white offenders, and the same reason the DAs don't prosecute them. These groups are practicing white supremacy. A collusive understanding exists that whites are to be treated differently than everyone else. The drive to criminalize the black community began in the 1960s. This was when a ton of laws were passed nationwide to make it where anyone charged with a felony could not vote. But then we saw black people being charged with felonies no matter how minor the offense, and white people being charged only with misdemeanors no matter how major the offense. And when that wasn't enough, the white establishment created an entire two-tiered legal structure. There was assault and misdemeanor assault, rape and sexual misconduct, murder and negligent homicide. Blacks were charged with the felony side of the law, and whites got charged with the misdemeanor side. And the aggregate result of this was Jim Crow 2.0. This was a way for blacks to be stricken from the voter rolls without having to use more obvious tactics like poll taxes or Klansmen at the polling stations. So, if it seems like the white media, the white lawmakers, and the white police are targeting black people and only black people based on race, that's because they are. The white community has been granted immunity from law, and this has gone from them feeling they had the privilege of killing other whites with impunity to now taking their penchant for group slaughter to other communities now. Violence tends to escalate, particularly when it's white violence. We see this at the individual, group, and global levels. As with all privileges, if left unchecked and unmonitored, it will soon be taken as a natural right. And when you look at how law enforcement more often than not aids and abets the white perpetrators of violence upon other whites, how the media wholesale ignores it, no wonder the crime statistics are as horrible as they are. It is not considered biased or prejudiced to admit that males commit more violent crimes than females, but for some reason it's forbidden to admit what simple math tells us. White males commit more violent crimes than any other ethnic group. Statistically, white males are far more dangerous than males of any other group. That's not racism, that's basic math. It is the selective denial of this that is racism. And yet the people who we all recognize to be statistically the most dangerous group in our society, the most violent prone, the most likely to slaughter innocents without a pang of remorse, who are being protected by a fraud of a justice system, that group is not monitored or punished. Only a fool would deny that there's a correlation here. There have been those who have seen this plague of white-on-white crime, and rather than discuss it, they have instead feverishly tried to change the subject. Their most popular deflection is to obsess over any example they can dig up of this or that black person who commits a crime. I cannot say whether white criminality is pathological, but this hyperactive reflex to focus on black people when they ought to be focusing on their own is pathological. Because the stats clearly show that whites kill more whites than blacks kill blacks, so common sense would tell us white-on-white crime ought to be a national priority, right? Not just for the media or the criminal justice system, but the society as a whole. To start to help the white community deal with their inherent desire for killing, we need to ask why they feel obsessed with focusing on the death toll in other ethnic communities, even though the white community's death toll is the highest. Except the white community feels their penchant for killing one another is a hopeless problem that they simply cannot solve. They also realize it's getting worse, not better. They're desperate for some way to feel good about themselves in the face of all this bad news, so since they can't fix their problem and are too afraid to even admit to it, instead they're trying to bury themselves under a mountain of talking points and fabricated data about the big bad black man. You'll find that historically this has been a recurring theme. Everyone, especially white people, knows the only reason there's any black-on-black crime is economics. Gangbangers and wannabes fighting over drug turf. Locked out of the legitimate economy, they're fighting for crumbs in the underground economy. Were there a level economic playing field, most of the black-on-black crime would evaporate overnight, the same way that we see no crime in the affluent black community, although we still see murder and horrifying acts of violence in the affluent white ones. But as we've seen in sports, music, and academics, when whites can't put their hands on the scales, they lose. Blacks took over sports and music, and Asians are taking over the colleges and universities. So a level playing field is a liability the white community simply cannot afford. While economics easily explains black-on-black crime, the white community, on the other hand, has no excuse of economic deprivation. You have people who have historically stolen from others the fat of the land and live lavishly, yet they kill each other for little reason or no reason at all. You never hear about black killers coming out of the black suburbs, or black middle class for that matter, but in the white community the number of white killers coming out of white suburbs is the same as the number coming out of lower socioeconomic strata. So economics has no bearing on white criminality. That's not racism, that's realism. The simple fact is, the main reason white people, white males in specific, commit their horrifying crimes is because they feel their existence doesn't matter. They want attention, and lots of it. This is what happens when your place in the world is based on lies. White skin privileges also means you look in the mirror and see someone floating through life with no real substance. Things happen not because you did anything, but because it was handed to you on account of your skin color. Everything about you comes down to accident of birth. At some point, you want to know what you're made of, and it hurts when you discover the answer. As Jason Black once said, when you start out with a lie, you end up with nothing. When you look in the mirror, you see nothing. And what do you call a creature that sees nothing when it looks in the mirror? A vampire. And what do vampires do? They feed on others. They're obsessed with others. Their lives revolve around stalking others. In the movies, the vampires present themselves as a kind of goth aristocratic elite, but even they know they're parasites living off of a host. The humans can do without the vampires. The vampires, however, would shrivel up and die without humans. And so a horrifying game of one-upmanship has broken out among white males to see who can commit the most shocking and unspeakable acts of mass slaughter. What does white supremacy mean to the rank-and-file white citizen? Well, the first thing that it means is that you are free from the bounds of the law. No one will judge or even criticize you because it simply won't be allowed. The Marquis de Sade himself said many years ago that laws were meant for the sheep, and that what was important was that the laws not touch the powerful man. As we all know, evil begets evil. Give people license to commit crimes with no punishment, not even so much as a tisk-tisk, and you're going to get a lot of crimes. The white community has never been examined for their behavior. That's another problem. They've been allowed to act any way they want, without examination or criticism, allowed to tell themselves they were morally exceptional when the facts would say exactly the opposite. And they've been allowed to indoctrinate themselves with fraudulent narratives, daily lies where they place the blame on everyone but themselves. Meanwhile, the daily procession of white victims of white murderers goes on without comment. If you're not smart enough to recognize this as racial propaganda, then you're probably a white supremacist. Many in the white community love to whine about the specter of Sharia law, especially how it affects women, but we already have a system of white male Sharia law in the U.S. far more violent and pervasive than anything the Muslims could have dreamt up. And the media doesn't say a word. In the American judicial system, white privilege takes the form of a series of safeguards against prosecution. DAs don't want to prosecute white offenders, so no matter how severe the offense, DAs will only charge them with a ridiculously low charge. But even if the DAs did want to prosecute white offenders, it would still be an uphill climb. Where white offenders are concerned, the charges have to undergo a crucible of roadblocks meant to prevent any successful conviction. There are a series of filters in place meant to break down the process of prosecuting a white person. The filtering begins with the police themselves, who don't charge white offenders when they clearly see them committing crimes. Then it continues with DAs who systematically downgrade any felony charge against a white offender to a misdemeanor, no matter how grave the crime was. And it continues with the judges who will dismiss evidence against white offenders and make rulings meant to guarantee a hung jury, mistrial, or, if all else fails, that the conviction is overturned on appeal. And with black defendants, the DAs prosecute cases even when it's blatantly obvious that no crime was committed. No matter how minor the alleged offense, they habitually upgrade the charges so that what started out as misdemeanors become felonies. This is not about law, it's about pushing a white supremacist agenda, because in the U.S. when you get convicted of a felony, you lose the right to vote. And the prosecutors wear their racism like a badge of honor. I told you about how the Caddo Parish DA was profiled by the New York Times because this small Louisiana enclave had more death penalty prosecutions per capita than anywhere else in America. More than Texas, more than Los Angeles, more than New York. And this redneck bragged that he wanted more black people to be on death row. Just this week in Orlando, Florida, following the 49-person massacre that took place there, one of the state's attorneys, Kenneth Lewis, went on Facebook and wrote, "The entire city should be leveled. It is void of a single redeeming quality. It is a melting pot of third world miscreants and ghetto thugs." And this wasn't the first time this Lewis character has done this. In 2014, he was temporarily reassigned after posting this on Facebook. "Happy Mother's Day to all the crack hoes out there." This is supposed to be an officer of the court, a man who took an oath to uphold the law. And the state's attorney's office is clearly protecting this creep. There's no justifiable reason on earth why this scumbag shouldn't have been stripped of his law license 2 years ago, disbarred, and every case he's ever touched subjected to review. This guy boasts of his open racism, and that he has nothing but contempt for the very city he's supposed to be helping to protect. If a school teacher says that the school they work at should be leveled and is devoid of a single redeeming quality, would any sane person want a child of theirs in the hands of a psychopath like that? Well, this isn't a school, it's an entire county. I hope now that it begins to become more clear why Angela Corey just couldn't seem to make a strong case against George Zimmerman, and why that animal always seems to slither his way out of prosecution time and time again. When you look at the racist comments on message boards, you better start asking, how many of them were put there by police and DAs and members of the media? And if you're too dense to realize that there's a program at work here, then you're clearly unaware of the incestuous ties between those who work in the legal profession and law enforcement and the media. Assistant DAs leave the public sector to work for law firms. The white shoe litigators go into government agencies and literally write the regulations and laws that their corporate paymasters are governed by. Racist judges like Antonin Scalia go to the Supreme Court and push a white supremacist agenda from the bench that they boldly admit would never make it through the legislatures. And speaking of incestuous ties, we haven't even gotten to the rotten underbelly of all this. The perverse relationship between the white media and law enforcement. There's a revolving door between your local police or sheriff's office and the TV news stations, newspapers, and radio stations. Or do you think it's a coincidence that shills like John Miller of ABC News has worked for the LAPD, the NYPD, the FBI, and even a brief stint at the CIA? And he's not alone. I encourage you to do some research about your own local police or sheriff's departments. Find out how many of their public liaisons officers were at one time employees at the local network affiliate, and vice versa. The media depends upon those in government to put regulations in place that allow them to dominate the local media markets. In return, the politicians depend upon the media for favorable treatment in the public eye. People keep lying and calling the media the fourth estate, but they're not. They're the auxiliary branch of government, the official propaganda wing. When the net neutrality vote was coming before the FCC, the media put in place a blackout on coverage of it, a regulation that affects every man, woman, and child in the country that will determine what you're allowed to see or hear. And the white media used its monopoly to render the American people deaf and blind. Were it not for the fact that most people in the U.S. are already on the internet, they wouldn't even have known about it. And how did the government respond to this corporate censorship, this media treason? They did nothing. Politicians more than anyone else prefer that the public be kept in the dark, because that's how you control masses of people. This is how white power has arranged itself to create a closed loop of corruption. One hand washing the other. All of them working in concert to ensure that the only crimes that get reported or highlighted or talked about involve black people. Whites are the vast majority of offenders, but that won't make the news. White-on-white crime far outnumbers so-called black-on-black, but the media's not talking about that either, and neither are the police. The government statistics are blatantly false, but don't expect to see any media outlets fact-checking or correcting for these errors. None of them will ask how many white people were arrested for murder but then had the charges reduced, or how many black people were charged as accessories to murder when they had nothing to do with it other than allegedly knowing the killer. You can readily prove the standard racial bias at work. I think that I should add that Wendy Bell, the racist reporter who was rightly fired for her open bigotry, is actually suing her old employer on the grounds of racial discrimination. That's right, her crackpot attorney is claiming that if she wasn't white, she would never have been fired. They're even threatening to sue for sexual discrimination, if you can believe that. Talk about throwing crap at the wall to see what sticks. I guess when you're a dried-out, wrinkled-up old bag with no prospects, this is what you're reduced to. But this media whore is just another example of how the lowest elements in the society are controlling what is called news. These are white supremacists demonizing black people and deliberately trying to create a hostile society based on half-truths and outright lies. And they're not even trying to hide it. But then again, why would they? Who are the overwhelming majority of police, the overwhelming majority of prosecutors, judges, lawmakers, and most of all, who are the overwhelming majority of people who run and own the media? You have a closed circle of white corruption. When you have 3 or 4 different groups acting the same, operating out of the same playbook, pursuing the same agenda, it's time to stop pretending that they're not working in collusion. What type of media slant would you expect to come from a system where the ties between all the participants is so incestuous? Historically, whites have used lies to deceive other whites into supporting their agendas. The lies took the form of some sort of ridiculous claim, a rotten story, if you will. These stories took an event, removed it from any and all context, presented one or two minor details in isolation, and then exaggerated those one or two details so as to manufacture a story meant to get whites to support agendas that did them more harm than good. Whether it was the Boston Massacre, British tales about evil Zulus killing innocent white invaders, Germans eating the babies of helpless other Europeans, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, or WMDs in Iraq. The use of narratives has been the primary means by which to get whites on board with bad ideas. And something black people need to understand about narratives. The target of the narrative is not whomever they're talking about. The target of the Gulf of Tonkin incident wasn't the Vietnamese. W's WMD hoax wasn't meant to influence the Iraqis. There's nothing wrong with falling for a lie so long as you smarten up once you know the truth. But when you willingly promote a lie because you're trying to get attention off of your own bad behavior, then that is wrong. And this is why the black-on-black crime narrative is so attractive to whites in general. White supremacy is a lie. It promoted itself through lies, used lies to justify its existence, and is now trying to hold on to life a little while longer through yet more lies. So if whites know these are lies and that these lies are harming them, why do they support them? Because most whites perceive that they're getting something out of it, even if it's only psychic benefits. For whites with true power and wealth to pat their fellow white indigents on the head. That's enough of a reward for the rank and file to feel like they're on the team. See Joe the wannabe plumber. Better yet, see the rubes who are supporting Donald Trump. This is not a case of having the wool pulled over their eyes. They are fiercely holding on to the blindfold and are ready to kill you if you try to remove it. When you've been given every crumb of your daily bread free of charge, you become dependent on whomever supplies it. So his interests of a necessity become yours. They love white supremacy because of the psychic benefits it gives, but more than that, they love the guarantees it's granted to them. So long as white supremacy continues to hand out the free swag, there's always going to be a critical mass of the white community who's willing to play along. All they have to do is lie every single day. You dance with the devil doesn't change. The devil changes you. The strategy of the white supremacist has been the big lie. Find something so outrageous it can scarcely be believed, and then repeat it until you're blue in the face. In this case, they take a Justice Department crime table that clearly shows whites commit the majority of violent crimes, and then they ignore that and focus exclusively on black people. If you're a white person concerned with the safety of other whites, wouldn't it make common sense to focus on white-on-white crime, since the data clearly shows there's an 86% chance you'll be killed by another white person? But this isn't about white safety at all. It's about getting their minds off what they do to one another. This self-deception is an integral part of white unity. These statistics the white supremacists have been cutting and pasting for the last few years are easily debunked, and afterwards all they can do is repeat the same talking point. But even were we so silly as to take the FBI crime data at face value, there's still problems with it. For starters, the FBI itself has not been able to do the basic math of adding 1 plus 1. You'll recall the media scandal that ensued when it was found that both Eric Garner and Tamir Rice, among others like John Crawford, were left out of the FBI's listing of citizens killed by the police. 3 of the most high-profile victims of police violence, and the FBI didn't include them on their list of police violence victims until after the public caught the error and embarrassed them on it. Common sense tells us the FBI is deliberately downplaying the numbers. After all, they're white supremacists running their own law enforcement agency too. But again, for the sake of argument, let's say the FBI did decide to include all the victims of white police violence. Even then, the FBI's stats would still not be credible, because the FBI gets its data directly from local and county law enforcement. The FBI doesn't vet the data that's provided. They don't even do spot checks to verify if even one police or sheriff department's data is inaccurate. They just cut and paste whatever Sheriff Clark or Joe Arpaio or whatever other white supremacist with a badge tells them. Look, I occasionally destroy some of the white supremacist stats not because I wish to get into a stat war with them. There's no war, they're liars, the stats prove it, and the selective parsing of the data only serves to make them look like fools. But I do it simply to help black people understand the depths white supremacy will go to distract whites in general from how bad their own condition is. If people were truly interested in crime, then they ought to be interested in all of it under all circumstances. But they've conditioned themselves to only be interested when the perpetrators, or victims, are not white. They are so steeped in denial they don't even dare call it white-on-white crime. Even the white media doesn't dare to utter that phrase. And we see this in all the instances of pathological white criminal behavior. Corruption on Wall Street is at epic levels, with all the bad actors being white, but never is race linked to that. Raping of school children by their teachers, the vast majority of offenders being white, and never is race linked to that. Arson is almost exclusively a white crime, but you wouldn't know it by the way the white majority refuses to talk about it, and of course, race is never linked to that. Domestic terrorism, mostly committed by white males, and mostly denied by white males. Serial killing, same denial, and mass killings. And yet all we hear about is black-on-black crime. As the Apostle Paul once said, "Methinks thou dost protest too much." When people make it a point to raise an unholy furor about an issue, but refuse to so much as acknowledge its existence when talking about themselves, you realize they're trying to distract you, or to distract themselves. Black people need to get it through their heads. There is evil in this world, in your city. Evil isn't something that only happens in New York, or only with racist cops, or only to other black people. Racism is not an accident either. And to not see this level of evil isn't the result of a bad upbringing or some psychological blind spot. We know right from wrong. The moral myopia that most whites seem to suffer from is the deliberate acceptance of a racist status quo. As I said before, when people think they're getting something out of a situation, they will defend pretty much anything that happens, no matter how blatantly wrong it is. And after a while, they become what they profess themselves to be. So don't hold your breath waiting for them to discover religion. It's not happening. And stop trying to come up with some talking points to convince yourself that they don't mean what they say, or that their racist acts are somehow tragic misunderstandings. The last 50 years, while the white media has been selling us fairy tales that the dominant society has changed, the last 10 years have shown us the truth. Racism is now resurgent, and it's white youths, so-called millennials, who are acting out the worst of it. When talking about bigots in history like Washington, Jefferson, or Woodrow Wilson, white people can always be counted on to drag out that old saw about, well, they were men of their time. So it doesn't surprise me that they don't say that about the young racists who we see on the news on a near daily basis. Dylan Roof, the SAE fraternity racists, even older racists like Wendy Bell and Ken Lewis. Well, so much for being products of their time. This is a culture that we're up against. These are institutional practices, and practice doesn't make perfect, it makes permanent. Now, we're either going to accept things as they truly are, focus on black empowerment, which doesn't mean chasing interracial sexual access, and get into this fight, or we simply keep repeating the pleasant-sounding but clearly dishonest lies the white media keeps feeding us. I know white supremacy is real, and I understand that it's everywhere. Do you?